Hello there, I'm Dominic St-Pierre and you're listening to Go Podcast. Today I'm joined by Adrian Hesketh, the creator of Templ, and Joe Davidson, a maintainer, and we are talking about Templ. Hey, just a quick note before we dive into the interview. So I took a small break of the podcast lately, so I need to think a little bit about the future of Go Podcast. You know, it's almost, it will be 3 years in December that I'm doing it. So yes, I mean, it's tough, but I need to think a little bit about that. But yeah, again, if you have any suggestion on topics or if you want to join me as a guest, I mean, do not hesitate to contact me. The best way at the moment is on Twitter. I'm considering to open a channel on the Go Slack community. So I mean, but yeah, we are talking about Templ today, and to be completely frank, after having this talk, I have been in contact with Templ before, and now I mean now that I've talked with those two guys and reread the entire documentation, which is not, it is not big. You can digest the documentation in like 20 minutes or something like that, and yeah, I'm now tempted to probably try to switch. I'm building something at the moment. I'm building a small SaaS, a small startup, and I'm using the HTML package. And yes, I'm now very tempted to try and see if Templ could work for me. But enough of that. Let's dive into the interview. Hello, Gophers. So I have two guests today. So thank you very much, Joe and Adrian, for joining me. So I will let you introduce yourself a little bit. So you are both maintaining or maintainer of Templ, the Go. I'm not even sure how to describe it correctly at this point, but let's say a library to do some HTML in Go. So if you want to introduce yourself, we will start from there.
Okay, well, I guess I'll start first. I'm Adrian, and I guess I started Templ and worked on it with Joe.
Yeah, and I'm Joe. I've been a developer for like 10 years now, and been doing Go for 4-ish years, and yeah, jumped on the Templ bandwagon. I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, right?
I think, yeah. I mean, I think you really helped shape the design of it, of how it sort of came about. Certainly, version 2 after the kind of initial first 12 months.
So how old is Templ actually? I came across. I think it was a kind of a long time ago, but maybe from the brief talk that I had with Joe, it seems to be an older project than what I would say most people are seeing it.
Yeah, I think it's probably 3 years old, maybe a little older even than that. I guess it started out as a bit of an experiment. I'd just come off a big project at work doing full stack TypeScript, and I kind of felt unsatisfied with the outcome for a few reasons. I mean, commercially it was a huge success, and the product worked and all the rest of it. But I felt like we'd spent a lot of time fiddling around with JavaScripty stuff and hadn't spent a great deal of time on the back end. And I just started to think to myself, like, is this really the best we can do? Is there something else we could do? Like, could I have spent more time improving the performance of the back end, and that would have resulted in a more traditional front end actually being a completely fine way to build this sort of site?
So I guess you were like building some kind of React application on the front end. Is that a good
that's
assumption?
right. Yeah,
okay.
Exactly. A big retail site. It was doing a couple of £1 million of revenue every day. It was doing great commercially, but it was a lot of like things like the build process for the front end was really long. It took a long time to build that stuff. And I guess that was a bit of a shock to me, having been a developer for a long time, just how long a JavaScript build can take with all the kind of bringing in all the NPM modules and all the rest of it. It seemed to take way longer than it ought to.
Oh, yeah.
And then also the coding of it was pretty complex as well. People had really gotten into things like use effect in React, and you could quite quickly tie yourself into knots in the ecosystem, and it took a bit of digging to get yourself back out of it, especially once you started layering on library after library and how those started to interact with each other. And I just thought to myself, hey, is there something else that we could be doing? And that kind of led me looking to things like Hotwire, as it was at the time, and then later HTMX. And I think initially with Templ, I was like looking to try and introduce some of the developer experience things that I felt like you couldn't really live without. Like, so things like I now expect to have autocomplete in tooling. I expect something that's a little bit like JSX. I expect components. And I expect syntax highlighting in my editor. I expect all of these kind of luxury items, and couldn't really see that in the Go ecosystem. So I basically started out trying to add things like IDE auto-completion to Go's built-in templates, and then looking at things like quick template and trying to add IDE auto-completion into there. But I realized quite quickly that it was probably not going to work because of the design of each of those. Hadn't really considered those capabilities from the outset.
When you say completion, you mean from the data that you are sending to the views, for example? Exactly that. So if you, for instance, if you're trying to sell car insurance or something, you typically want to have you might have an insurance document or something that has like hundreds of fields, and just making sure that you're displaying the right fields to the user and that you can discover them. Yeah, totally. I get it. So at some point you wanted to try and see if you could like replicate the experience that you were having on the back end, but for front end kind of output.
Yeah, I guess I realized that a lot of the work I was doing was really just building forms. It's like, a pretty basic form app. You're putting in your address, you're doing some basic stuff. You have to do some validation on the client side, but then you have to do the validation again on the server side anyway. And I thought, well, you're kind of developing it twice there. You're kind of doing something on the client, doing something on the server. Okay, you might be using, one of these JavaScript frameworks where you've got sort of server-side rendering on the back, or you might do some sort of back-end stuff with Next.js or so on. But even then, you've probably got some other APIs that you're interacting with that also do some validation. And it just seemed like, there's a lot of layers here, and there's a lot of replication of effort.
Yeah, I hear you on that. So would you say, how would you describe Templ, for example? To whom exactly are you targeting? Or at least in that moment when you started the project?
I get, when I was starting the project, I was really targeting the Go development team, the people that make the Go programming language. If I'm honest, what I was really wanting to show was like a demonstration of, what was really necessary, I felt, for Go to be useful for building web front ends. I didn't feel like the built-in templating was enough. And I guess what I was hoping to do was show, like, hey, if we had this sort of thing, that would be great.
Yeah, and do you have any? Well, yeah, this is interesting to me. So that sentence that you just said. So the Go HTML template was not enough, and I feel you on that. I'm half and half. I would even say. So sometimes I feel like I would want something else. Sometimes I just find it like decently stable. So my question is, at this point in the Go community, it's kind of difficult to bring a new or a library to the table. I mean, it's built into our mindset. You know, people that are doing Go for a long time. I don't know if it's because we have been bitten by dependencies or third parties libraries in the past, or what exactly it is. But so was that a concern when you started the project at all?
Oh yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, you absolutely, you know, I didn't want to create a new library. You know, I wanted to work on quick template or work on adding auto completion to the built-in features of Go. I didn't want to be that person who makes another library when there's already 10 perfectly good ones. But like a lot of the like front end, I guess a lot of the HTML templating libraries for Go had either been sort of abandoned or, you know, didn't really have that support for the syntax that would allow them to support the auto completion.
And would you say that Templ is, well, maybe today or at least back then when it started, more targeted at people that are used to build React application, that they are kind of finding things that they are used to, like the component, for example, and things like that. So or would you say that? Yeah, okay.
I think that's a fair statement because I guess, you know, I've been developing web apps for over 20 years now. So I guess when I started out, I was doing sort of Perl and that kind of stuff.
Nice.
And then went into ASP 3.0 with using VB script.
Yeah.
And then moved into ASP.NET web forms and stuff like that. And then moving through to MVC. And obviously, you know, there's all sorts of different techniques along the way, like Django apps and all the rest of it. So I've seen lots of technologies kind of come and go over the years before moving on to things like Knockout.js and then through to React and all that kind of stuff. So I've seen a lot of different tech come and go through the period. And I guess there's always so to me, looking at the Go side of things, but that's available in the templates, it looked far worse than what I had 10 years ago. And I just thought that can't be right, you know, in the sense of developer experience. When with Razor Views, I had a lot of the kind of ability to build components or partial elements, the ability to sort of bundle things up in libraries and distribute them, share them across teams, and that sort of thing. And then, definitely, I guess if you think about it from the most basic proposition, there's a few libraries in Go that take the approach of writing HTML in Go code. So you just kind of write HTML out by hand. I can't remember the name of them, of one of them. I think one of them might be Gomponents. I think that's right. And with that one, you kind of write HTML in Go. And that's probably the most efficient way. You don't need a kind of DSL or HTML parser and all the rest of it. But I thought it, what people are used to, and when I'm introducing this concept to a team of, right, okay, everybody, if you get web developers today, chances are that they've learned React. They might, in many cases, they haven't really learned to build HTML apps outside of that React ecosystem. They've often started from React, and that's their first experience of building web applications. So we've gotten to the point now where I think I remember working with a junior engineer, and the concept of a HTTP form post was completely alien because he'd spent his whole career so far sending data over, the Fetch API, and didn't really understand that you could do a HTTP form post. That's the world we're in now, where we're so far removed in some cases from that you have to go back to the beginning and sort of re-explain some of the old-fashioned ideas, which I guess is where the hypermedia book comes in handy, I think.
Interesting. So I guess that's a little bit why you were saying that maybe HTMX for you was not the solution, or at least for this particular junior developer, at least probably.
Well, HTMX is great. It's more the case of when you're introducing something to a team. it has to be something that, the whole team has to be able to buy into that concept, if you like. So I felt like the idea of writing raw Go and building up web applications through that would be a little bit intimidating. And I thought that it would be more straightforward to see something that looked a little bit more like the JSX that they were used to, but ultimately gave you you still had the composition, you still had the developer experience, you still had all the other stuff that you were used to, but you have that kind of familiarity.
Right. So Joe was telling me that at first there were the templating syntax was not what it is, because what it is today, correct me if I'm wrong, because I haven't used Templ yet, but it's similar to, it's good old HTML at the moment, but at first you were having handlebar braces for inputting the data, I guess.
Yeah, I think well Joe, do you want to tell that story? Because I think it was the feedback came from you, when through our first use of it in a commercial setting, right?
Yeah, so I think it's hard to describe the syntax with words, but essentially, if you've used handlebars before, that was the initial syntax. So if you wanted a if statement, for example, you would do open curly brace, %, if, % curly brace. After the if, you would put your condition, and then you'd have your HTML inside of that, which would be rendered conditionally, and to close that off you would have a open curly % end if, and then another % in closed curly bracket, and it served its purpose for a while, because the initial thing was to prove that we could have strongly typed Go templates with language server capabilities. But as we were using it ergonomically, we started using it to generate documents, legal documents. So the strongly typed part was very important for us. We couldn't be getting any kind of runtime errors like you can with the Go HTML templating. But we were getting our hands dirty with using that syntax. It felt less familiar to actual Go code, so the benefits that I could see were that you had familiarity moving from Go code into a .templ file, and I wanted to kind of increase that familiarity. I wanted to kind of have everything be ergonomic, like a user could guess what the thing that they I thought that a user should be able to guess what the syntax was for the feature that they were trying to use, rather than having to refer to the docs. And I think that meant a lot of thinking around syntax and how can we combine HTML and Go and not add a third component, which is like Templ syntax.
Right.
And there's still some parts that are kind of Templ specific, but I think, keeping in mind HTML and Go as much as possible was the priority that I had when I came to Adrian with the idea of changing the syntax.
So I was sick of typing the extra characters as well by that point. So I was like, let's do this.
So it was compiled at some point, right? Was that was there any parser, or it was directly compiled into something else at that time?
Yeah,
there was always a parser. So I set out with a basic parser from the get go. So it would turn into a basic object model of HTML elements, and then it would look specifically for if statements. But it was initially it was quite basic. It looked for things like the end of the line and stuff like that. But the initial kind of proof of concept worked really, really well, and I was comfortable enough to sort of take it into production. And Yeah, it was a sort of two-step process. So the first step is to pass it into the object model, and then there's a Go generation step that generates raw Go code. And what that really does is really helps on the performance side of things, because the object model disappears at runtime. It's just rendering out strings as quickly as it can, so it approaches really good performance, like approaches the performance of quick template.
So even back then, you had like a way to know what data was passed to a function, for example, and
yeah,
you were having like not the autocomplete and whatnot, right? You were having suggestion about this is the structure that I'm receiving. Those are the fields and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, right from the first go, because that was the whole point. Really, was I was basically looking for a templating language in Go that I could say, yeah, this is good, and I wanted it to have autocomplete. That was it. I just, I thought to myself, I'm not having autocomplete in 2021 or whatever it was. Like, can't live like this.
Okay, maybe it will be a newbie question, because I haven't used it. So let's say I'm creating a function or a component. Let's call it a component. So I would guess that it's going to be a function that returns some kind of HTML or things like that.
Yeah.
How can I be using that function? So if it's going to need to be parsed and there's some Go generation, what is the flow for a typical developer to continue to have access to those new functions that you are creating? So is it always running on the background, for instance?
Yeah. So when you're in the editor, if you like, the language server is constantly being notified in real time of every keystroke that you make. So what it does is it's constantly parsing your document every time you make a change, passes it into the object model, and then converts it into Go code. And when it generates the Go code, it keeps references to the specific locations in the Go code that it's just added. Like, so if you create an if statement, for instance, it keeps in memory the location of that if statement within the generated Go file itself, and then when it generates that Go code and sends it to the Go Please language server, and the Go Please language server might respond back with some diagnostics, and those diagnostics might be referencing a section in the Go code which is ultimately back in the Templ code. So it does a reverse lookup on the location in the Templ file, and then puts the diagnostics in the correct location in the Templ file. So in that way, that's how the kind of language server element of it works. But in terms of like developer workflow, you create a Templ file, you write Templ, which is like a replacement for the keyword func, and then you define a function, and you can just write HTML in that function, and then you run the Templ generate command line. It generates you a Go file that has that function that you just created expressed inside the Go file, and then you can call the render method that on the results of that.
Okay, so you constantly need to call this generate tool.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay,
but it's fast.
Yeah. Right.
And there's also a watch mode built into Templ as well, so you can run Templ watch, and it'll watch all of the Templ files and auto generate new files in the background. In fact, there's a little optimization in there that one of the contributors added, where if you're in watch mode, you can also get it to read from files on disk, so it doesn't actually recompile your Go program. So I think one of the challenges of working in a compiled language and building web applications in a compiled language is what happens when you get used to this idea of like, I'm looking at my web page, I make a change to my code, I hit save, and when I look back at the web page, I want to see those changes reflected in real time, right? Yeah. And in a Go program, if you're building a kind of monolithic web app, it might actually take a second or so for the web server to start back up again. as you do things like reestablish database connections, or it depends on the startup time of your application and what you've done to optimize it, right? But you want to get into this kind of quick cycle of make a change, see it reflected on the screen. So one of the somebody contributed a change which you can put the watch into a mode where it only recompiles it reads the text strings from a file on disk, so you can make changes to the text that's on the screen without completely recompiling and restarting your web server. And that makes it faster, so you can have this kind of cycle of looking through your changes really quickly.
Which was a massive improvement, and people do expect to have that these days in their web development stack. Like, I think initially there was a lot of kind of requests for a hot reload that was faster. So I think someone must have. I wish I could remember their name now, but
I'd have to look at the commit history.
Yeah,
that was it as well. That was the only change they've ever made. Like, just came in, did that, and never seen them again.
Yeah,
this sounds awesome. I mean, yeah, I can see. So maybe I can tell you exactly why I haven't used Templ yet, because I think maybe I'm not alone, or maybe I am. I don't know. So for me, when I started to look at the documentation and understood that, okay, you know what, I will have this new Templ file format now. I was kind of distracted by the fact that maybe I would not have all. How can I say that? All the things that I'm used to from my editor when I'm editing HTML file. I'm talking about maybe autocomplete, maybe collapsing some div. Sometimes I do that because I need to move them. Being a blind person, for me, HTML is kind of a pain to edit. So I was kind of very prudent about that, because now there's some Go code intermixed with HTML. So that was my concern.
Yeah, I can't even begin to imagine the challenge there. To be honest, that's really tough. You're absolutely right. It has been. I think people have, I guess, what's really interesting about having a library like Templ that suddenly becomes popular is that you realize how different everybody's workflow is. And, there certainly isn't a one size fits all kind of thing, like Joe and I both use NeoVim as an editor, right? But a lot of users use VS Code, and others use kind of the IntelliJ suite as well. And one of the things that really surprised me was how much people use the HTML auto-completion features in VS Code, which frankly I didn't even know existed, because I've only ever really done React in VS Code. And in React, you don't get those features at all. So I was like, what are people going on about? I don't understand. But it took a while to get to understand it. And I think somebody just recently added some basic document outlining, didn't they, Joe? You merged it just the other day.
Yeah, the kind of attribute autocomplete based on HTML, because kind of in VS Code world you can't have multiple extensions kind of controlling one file. So for me and Adrian, we're using NeoVim, where you can have multiple language servers running against the same file. So we can just turn on the Templ language server, the HTML language server, the HTMX language server, and get all the features from all of them. Whereas with VS Code, you have to assign one extension to one file type. But yeah, a user had found a setting in the VS Code configuration that allows you to kind of pull in another language server essentially as a dependency. So yeah, now there's HTML completion as well as the standard Templ and Go completion.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very. And what about for me it's not really the auto completion more than the when I'm on a div. I often need to go to the end of that div. So when for sighted people, it's very easy for you to navigate around. So that is crucial for me. So I understand that everything that you say about the language server being a single, but that's good. I will need to test it. So let's return a little bit to.
I mean, that does sound interesting. Being like, I think NeoVim has some features around sort of moving between different elements and so on. So I think again, it's very sort of individual specific on that stuff. But always happy to sort of try and accommodate people for sure.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's I would personally use Vim more, but VS Code is so friendly for for blind people. So for instance, when I'm collapsing some div, there's some audible sound that tells me this block is now. Because switching from HTML is so verbose. If you can imagine a person that is using a screen reader has to kind of listen to all the div, the classes, the things. So I mean, it's pretty rough.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, it's not. I'm not representing a huge portion of the Go developers. So. Let's say I want to do looping and whatnot. So are you just doing some good old Go in there, like I can use a for with the range and things like that. Do ifs and things like that. So it's all like standard Go basically in the template.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of like the control flow. Keywords you would expect to work in a Templ file all should work. Like you have your for, if, switch statement. They all work. You write your HTML, and if you write an if statement, there's no special syntax to kind of signify it's an if statement. You just write it and then continue writing HTML within the curly braces of that if statement. The only time you have to kind of do any kind of Templ syntax is to do interpolation into HTML. So you need some curly braces opening and closing to write maybe a Go function that returns a string or something like that.
Interesting. And what about? I mean, when I'm using the template / the HTML template, the bare bone things. I'm often using like, I don't know how to when I structuring my pages, for example. So let's say we are building an app like a CRM, for example. So you might have a template for your main application, and when a user go from pages to pages, I mean the global shell of the application stays the same. So how would I structure a template like that in Templ, like a base views, for example, or layout pages?
So we have composability, so the ability to put like other HTML components into your component and kind of build a tree of Templ components, and you do that by putting a @ symbol before the function call to your sub component. But there's kind of this other concept of I think we call it block components. So you do @ symbol your function call, and then you would open curly braces and start writing HTML within that. So it's kind of like a wrapper around the child HTML. It's kind of like in React how you would do like an open tag and close tag for a React component, and within that component's code you would be able to tell it where to render the children. So that composability is how I would do a layout in Templ.
There's essentially like the components like are essentially functions. So it's a case of passing functions to functions is one way, or you can have this concept of like we say, like the concept of I'm wrapping some children, and you can pass. So you can kind of, you don't want to make a big song and dance about the kind of creating an extra component. You can kind of create an anonymous child component for elements, because it's the most common, I guess, the most common use case.
Right. And what does it look like? So let's say we are in a typical Go handler, an HTTP handler. So how would I render the top level component, for instance? Because I would guess that if it's component based like that, I would choose let's render, I don't know, the dashboard page or whatever it's called.
Yeah. So I might start out that approach by having a page component. Mm-hmm. And the page component is a function that takes in possibly the body. It might take in some meta information or some other info. And since the page is, aside from that page, I might have a page one function. And that page one function is really the content of the page. So it just starts from H1 and proceeds, to display an article or something. And then you would call the page function and pass it the page one function. So you've got like the layout. I should have called it layout instead of page. So let's say I'll start again and say, okay, I'll create a function called layout, a Templ component called layout that takes in a component called content. And then it's a case of calling layout and passing it the content.
Yeah, I got it. So and you would pass so let's say you wanted to pass a structure, you would pass that to your content component directly.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
You can also do. There's also a concept of drilling through, like prop drilling through context as well. So you can pass a component through and grab it out of the context for later if you really want to. But I prefer to be explicit on the whole. There's some information on the documentation about like the concept of prop drilling and how that kind of manifests itself. It's a kind of React concept, but the idea is obviously like if you've got like a lot of top level information and then you want to use that sort of deeply nested within the hierarchy, you can either pass that information all the way down through each component call, but that can lead to complexity in refactoring, where a simple change that's deeply nested in the hierarchy results in, changes all the way through the hierarchy. So you can kind of avoid that by the concept of prop drilling, by passing things through the context if the layers in between those two elements are not really important.
And it's kind of as a usability kind of standpoint, if you're building a component to be used elsewhere, if you're using values from the context, you're not really communicating the contract of what's required for that component.
Right.
So it may just throw an error because you're not passing the right things into the context. So that might be fine if you're a developer on your own and you know exactly what's required for each function. But on a team, and especially if you're building a component library or something for other people to use, you want to be very explicit about what's required and what can be passed in.
But, Templ is really flexible because it's really based around the concept of a single interface. And so the Templ component interface is an interface that has one function on it called render. And the render function takes a context and an IO writer and returns an error. So you can implement the Templ component interface in program code. And that allows you to do things like if you have a HTML template, there's some conversion functions in the Templ library that just let you include that as a Templ component in the rest of your system. and vice versa. Actually, you can render a Templ component and use it within another ecosystem.
Yeah, I can see how sharing things from across teams would make more sense than, I don't know, pitching some loose HTML file and hoping that I would expect that once you get used to having strongly type views like that, I mean you just cannot really go back to having some kind of I don't know, the any interface pass to your views.
Yeah, it's definitely gives you a lot of confidence. I actually had someone reply to a tweet. They said that Templ reduced their anxiety, which was interesting.
Well, that's good. That's good. Although, I also said, I think that same tweet, I think someone said, I will never use that. Are we allowed to swear on here? Because I think some people react really strongly to the kind of DSL element to it, don't they?
Right.
Like, some people are like, oh yeah, okay, that looks friendly, that's like HTML, and other people are like, what's the point of that, right? Like, you could write that in Go code. Why would you introduce the DSL? I guess my stock answer to that is, with React, JSX and TSX is compiled down to JavaScript, right? Ultimately, under the covers, it's writing out react.create element. But you'd never see anybody write that, do you? Nobody sits down and goes, today I'm going to write down react.create element. Mostly people use the JSX and TSX syntax because they find it convenient.
Yeah, totally. You don't have to sell me on that. I was a huge fan of Helm, and I mean Helm at the end of the day is just a DSL as well. Yeah, I'm curious to know a little bit more about when you say earlier that there might have been some challenges turning an issue or a warning from the language server back to the Templ code, because at the end of the day, when the Templ code is generated into Go, so how are you going from that error or this Go code back to the template?
So when we generate Go code from the template, when we have the concept then of we pass the template into an object model, and the object model is it describes each of the elements in the Templ file. So it has the concept of a Go expression, and it has the concept of like an interpolated, so for instance, if you look at a HTML element, right, it has the concept of a HTML element that you pass into, and then the attributes themselves can be of different types. And one of the attribute types is like a string expression attribute, which knows that that it's going to render a bit of Go code as an attribute value. And then there's also a string expression when you're rendering out some Go code in a HTML context, just in the body of your HTML. So when we're rendering those little sections into the target Go code, we keep a record of where those are in the target Go code. And when we receive a diagnostic from Go Please about that, we can then remap the location from the Go code right the way back into the Templ code. And so that puts the red squiggly underline for those who can see the the visual kind of things. That's where you see the diagnostics, or you, I guess in your case, maybe get a list of the diagnostics for your tool.
Yeah, when you're using a screen reader, there's also a sound for this squiggly line. Yeah,
I'm gonna have to check this out.
VS Code is pretty good for a screen reader user. I would prefer to use Vim, but I mean, at the end of the day, what you want to do? I need to go with the. I was an Arch user, Arch Linux user for a long time, but at some point, I needed to switch to screen reader, so it's Windows for me now. What can I do? Yeah, it sounds pretty interesting. So what about the challenges? We know. I mean, this sounds pretty interesting as code. The parser, the generator, and also going back to was that hard? Is there Is there any challenges left for Templ actually?
I think so. Yeah, I think there's a lot of challenges. I think the initial challenge of LSP was really that at the time there wasn't a great deal of documentation around how to do it. So, the language server protocol kind of came about through VS Code, and it was really driven from the VS Code development team, and then other people adopted it. Really, it's not, it wasn't sort of. So it's written in TypeScript, basically, is the specification. So you have to have a pretty good understanding of TypeScript anyway to read the spec. But it's also, it also has some JavaScript isms in it, as in like, oh, we're going to return something, but it could be one of these, but it could also be a different type completely, and it might be an array. Like, so you have those kinds of issues to deal with. And I guess I initially started off with the source graph LSP library, but then there were some changes to the spec and it wasn't really sort of maintained. So I switched over to another library and figured out how to use that. And I maintain a little fork of that now because occasionally I run into sort of incompatibilities or issues or need to move a little faster than that library. That one is at lsp.dev library, which is pretty good. But it seems like it's mostly, generated from kind of the spec and trying to sort of follow the spec. But I think the main challenge really was trying to, understand what the editor was going to send and the structure that it was going to send. So it's okay to read the spec, but the spec really just covers the message structure. It doesn't really cover so much the handshaking between the editor and the LSP and how that works. So it works over a protocol called JSON RPC. There's a concept of a sending a message and then receiving a message, or sending a notification which then doesn't receive a message back. But they can also be interleaved, so you can send multiple messages and then get out of order responses. I guess you can do JSON RPC over any transport, but the one that the LSPs mostly use is standard in and standard out. So you open up a process. So in my case, if you open up Templ LSP, NeoVim will kind of open up Templ LSP and then start passing messages over standard input, and then it'll expect some responses back over standard output. So I guess the main challenge was really kind of building up inspection of those kinds of things, working out what was going on, which bits of the messages were important, which bits weren't important, and that sort of thing. So I think that was a bit of a challenge to get started with. And then I guess it's just a lot, really, building a VS Code extension, dealing with the LSP and dealing with everything else. It's just none of it is particularly, hard. It's just that there's a lot of it.
Yeah, I would guess there's a lot of noise as well, probably in those payload that you're receiving from, or at least that you have to send and things like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. But I was really keen to try, to make Templ into, I have a job, I have hobbies and things that aren't Templ, So I want to make sure that this thing is a sort of sustainable project, not not something that needs a full-time team to look after it forever, although if someone wants to pay me, go for it. But it's got to be sort of maintainable over the period. So we have to also be careful not to try and do too much. And I think initially I probably tried to, because I think initially I was thinking of it as more of a demonstration in the first year. Some of those decisions I've had to walk back a little bit around taking on too much around things like JavaScript bundling or CSS handling and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that was maybe my next question. So are you sensing some kind of pressure or something like that? Since they're the project seems to be growing decently and things like that. I mean, it's getting more and more popular, I believe, as time goes. So how are you handling all this?
I think,
Go for it.
I was going to say, I think we're still learning on that. I think we're getting better at it. I'd say at first we were just very excited that people were using it to the point where they had their own ideas about how it could work. But like Adrian says, now we're kind of coming to the point where there's a lot of people who have some ideas about it. We need to kind of parse through those and think, what is the cost to implementing it? Because even if someone contributes code, it's not zero cost for us, because we're going to have to kind of interface with them to ensure that the quality is what we're expecting and that kind of thing. And around the design, does it flow with the rest of Templ? If someone's adding a language feature, is it ergonomic, like we were talking about before? Is it introducing the least amount of extra code as possible? So I think what we're trying to do now is kind of have a bit of a slower process to adding language features, where there's discussion and we invite everybody to pitch in on the conversation to make sure that we're doing what's best for Templ, the users, and us.
Yeah, I would imagine. It's hard to. This is a challenge for sure. Was there any kind of breaking change at some point, or it always has been like very stable?
Been really careful on breaking changes, actually. So even though even the massive syntax change between version 1 and version 2, I built a migration tool. So you could run Templ migrate, and It would migrate everything over to version 2. I don't think it was 100% perfect because of some kind of bugs probably in the early version, in version 1. But yeah, I was able to eventually get the last kind of early adopters off version 1 and remove the V1 to V2 conversion tool and all the old V1 stuff from the repo. So yeah, I've been we've been being a bit more conservative. So instead of adding a new feature, we've now got experimental feature flags as well. So we can put in an experimental feature and sort of try it out for a little while before we kind of break anybody's workflow by mistake and that kind of thing. So that's another important element of it. But at the same time, I don't want to have a configuration file in Templ, because as soon as you have a configuration file, you then have like multiple ways that something can break or things can interact in ways that you weren't expecting. So trying to keep it, that's one of the strategies to sort of keep things simple. It means that, every now and again someone will complain about the way that things are formatted or something. You're like, well, that's the way it's formatted,
Yeah. Oh yeah.
We did have one breaking change, which I remember, which it was kind of interesting because it was completely unexpected. So we had this idea so in the generated Go code, there's some variables that are used. So there's context variables, there's variables to temporarily store the string literals and all the Go code expression responses. And we wanted to reduce the likelihood that someone's variables that they're declaring in their component wouldn't clash with our sort of runtime variables. So what we did was we prefixed every Templ variable with sort of a randomly, this kind of random string, Templ underscore, and then some numbers, just to avoid a clash. And I think we thought that was kind of a sensible thing to do to avoid any really unexpected things from happening. But it turned out that people were actually using the context variable that gets passed into the render function to do prop drilling, as we mentioned before. So we had to revert that change for just that context variable. which I found that kind of interesting, and now it forms part of our documentation where we point out context values as a way of kind of passing information.
Yeah. So you do have like an implicit context that you can just grab hold of, which is probably the only weird bit about it, I guess.
Yeah.
Interesting. So what is next for you guys? I mean, is there any V3 on the pipeline? Is the V2 is mostly what the vision that you had for the project?
I think there's still a lot to do, particularly around integration with JavaScript and CSS, and really rounding out like a comprehensive way of building web applications. So, like, if you like, React isn't really powerful because of React as much as it is powerful that I can pull down a React component that does something really well. So, like, if I want to have a table that has sorting, I can grab one. I can pick one of these off-the-shelf user interface libraries, and I can knock myself up a website that kind of looks okay pretty quickly. One of the kind of in the commercial kind of settings that I work in, you'll have like an organization and they'll make a design system and they'll put all the work into making sure that each of the components has been through the kind of accessibility testing requirements and all the rest of it, meets the brand guidelines and uses the right fonts, has the right shape and everything else. And so, when you're building an application for one of these big companies, you're really just kind of collecting all of these pre-made text boxes and other elements and assembling them together. So people have started to make a similar ecosystem type components for Templ. So for instance, somebody's made like an interesting hot reload capability that adds on to what kind of Templ ships. Somebody's like, there's been at least 3 different design system type things with kind of libraries of components that I'm aware of. There's some work to do around CSS bundling, and people have got some interesting ideas around how we might tackle bits and pieces like that. And then we've been doing a bit of work around like interacting with JavaScript, because JavaScript doesn't go away just because we decided to do some sort of server-side rendering, right? Like, it's still super important for us. But then we're looking at people are using tools like Alpine, and they need to pass data to sort of Alpine stuff, and how do we make that easy? So we added some features around that recently. We've got there's a whole bunch of new stuff. So recently we added support for a new feature called the declarative shadow DOM in HTML. So we added streaming responses, and declarative shadow DOM is like a bit like you can define templates in HTML as part of the HTML standard. So what that allows you to do is render a placeholder, render the rest of the page, and then go back and populate the placeholder later. And that's kind of interesting because a lot of the time you might have loaded a web page and then done some kind of asynchronous loading using JavaScript to populate some sections of the page that you didn't want to do server-side for some reason. But now you can do that entirely within a single HTTP request. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, this sounds great. So when you say design system, so am I understanding that something like Templ UI, so component that would be already styled or not Tailwind, but this would be my dream. I mean, I'm searching for that for a long time. Just something that would be similar to what native desktop and maybe mobile. I never done mobile, but just having some decent style for HTML without having to have all the Tailwind classes or any other CSS framework. So am I understanding that there's people working on that?
Absolutely, yeah. It's so we mentioned before that the kind of build process for Templ is going from a .templ file being generated into Go code. this means that shipping a Templ component, it's just a case of doing that generation step and then pushing it to a public GitHub repo. So there's various projects out there already, like I think there's one called Go Ship It, there's one called Templ UI, I think, that all provide components that you can use directly in your own .templ files. You just have to do a go get and then import it at the top of your Templ file, just like you would import anything else in Go.
Wow, this sounds pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. It's what I always hoped would happen, because I kind of designed it around this idea of, building component libraries, just because that's kind of what I was seeing commercially. Yeah. So in fact, the Templ repo has a little bit of it's got a storybook thing. So I don't know if you've come across Storybook, but it's like a way that you can kind of share component libraries and stuff. So initially I was thinking about what is the story for a kind of comprehensive system for building web apps. You need to have components, you need to be able to reuse components, share them, you need to be able to integrate with JavaScript, you need to have a good developer experience, and the performance has to be adequate. It doesn't have to be amazing, but it has to be adequate. I mean, but just by the nature of it being written in Go, it's much faster than the JavaScript kind of ecosystem anyway. So yeah, I think I wrote down just yesterday, actually, Joe, that we need to create an awesome Templ GitHub repo that just has a list of all of the cool stuff that people are building with Templ, and sort of start to maintain that, because I guess, yeah, there's a bunch of kind of adjacent projects like that kind of round out the ecosystem. And I think, that's really what you need, I think, to build an alternative world to that JavaScript stuff. It requires a whole set of ecosystem components. So some of the things that people have been asking, I guess actually, what's really one of the things that you might not realize about Templ is that a lot of people who are writing Templ, it seems to be the first Go they've ever written.
Huh.
They're coming to Go to write Templ, and that completely blew my mind. I did not expect that at all.
Because those developers are more front-end developers?
Not necessarily. A lot of the time, it can be a number of things. It can be they're either beginners, or they just fancy picking up a bit of Go, or they just come to it from a different ecosystem, and they use it. One person said, "Oh yeah, I'm using it at work," because, and suddenly they're using Templ. And so they ask questions, and you go, okay, right. And it becomes obvious that, they've never written Go before, because they don't know about things like imports or some of the other things. And again, the other thing is, in some cases, people are writing their first web apps as well, because, they're not familiar with some of the techniques and stuff around it, or, they're not, or perhaps they're not used to things like CSRF or other techniques as well. So there's a lot of kind of questions you have to kind of help people through, which is why I've been focusing on the documentation as well. So at some point, we need to get an LLM bot in there for sure.
Of course.
Yeah, I was seriously thinking about publishing a set of embeddings, pre-populate the embeddings so people can run it through their own LLMs.
Nice. Yeah, this is intriguing. I will need to test it, to be frank. I've read the entire documentation. I think it was probably 6 or 7 months ago, and as much as I was reading, I was very, very interested. But again, I mean, I have some challenges myself, which has nothing to do with Templ, but I would just need to test it myself. So what would you... So if we were to wrap up at this point, because I don't want to keep you too long. So what would you say to someone that has heard about Templ? Maybe they haven't started yet. So what's a good tip? Where should they go, or at least are you recommending them to start a new project, or it could be side by side with the HTML template package? What's the game here?
absolutely can be side by side. There's, we're trying to sort of fit nicely with the rest of the ecosystem. I do see it as an ecosystem. So like, that's why, things like components will work very well inside Templ and all the rest of it. So we're looking for an ecosystem. I guess I guess it depends on what you're trying to build, really, and what you're trying to do. And the skills. Like everybody brings their own kind of problems, if you like, to whatever scenario they've got. But I would just say to people, give it a blast. Do a hello world and see how it feels to you. There's a website at templ.guide, and there's a kind of getting started guide. It's fairly straightforward to begin.
Yeah, we will have this link on the show notes. So thank you for your time. I mean, it was great. Maybe we could do that a little bit further. Maybe in 2-3 months. I don't know if you are up to it. I would still pretty much like to test it and give you some feedback on how it's working with the screen reader. But yeah, I'm very interested in the project. Sorry.
That would be great. I'd like to see how that works and see what kind of missing features we might have. It may well be that we need to add some sort of semantic markers into the LSP feature, because I think someone was adding some basic outlining because they were complaining about the lack of collapsing of elements. Like I think you mentioned that earlier. So this kind of concept of outlining and stuff is certainly something that people are working on. Like I say, I think we've had over 100 contributors now to Templ over the last couple of years. Mostly, obviously, like little things like documentation and stuff. But people are taking on like bigger pieces over time.
Very nice. It's pretty inspiring to see that, because, like I was saying at some point, I mean, there's a little bit of friction sometimes in the Go community for library that do, a little bit what the standard library is doing, if I can say that.
Like I said, if the standard library wanted to introduce a strongly typed system that allows you to call arbitrary functions, that doesn't panic and all the rest of it, yeah, absolutely. I'll write. The last Templ I'll ever write will be the migration tool to get you off Templ onto the standard library. That'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Thank you very much for your time. So again, I would encourage everyone that if you haven't checked Templ yet, go ahead. Those guys are there. You can contribute on the project, and it seems to be very great. Thank you very much for your time.
We also hang around in the Gopher Slack if there's any questions.
Nice. Oh yeah,
join there.
I will have that on the show note for sure. All right. Thank you very much. All right. That's it for this week. I would really appreciate if you can talk or share about this podcast. It's always helpful. Also, another way to support this show is by purchasing my course. There's always a link in the show notes. So on that, see you next week.